This video is really more about a question than any answer, and that question is, why did economics as a discipline and a science develop so slowly? And by most reasonable standards, economic reasoning as being scientific really was quite slow to develop. So if we take the so-called marginal revolution, which heralds the arrival of modern economics, well, that doesn't really fully come until 1871, and it's not even internalized into all the textbooks until the early 20th century. Adam Smith, who was a landmark in the history of economic thought, by some standards the greatest economist of all time, well, he's writing his masterwork in 1776. Just to give another example, Dudley North, I think of him as the first economics pamphleteer who at least is speaking some kind of modern language of supply and demand economics. It's not necessarily deep or sophisticated, but he sounds like a modern economist in some ways. He's the first person to do that, and that's coming in 1690. For purposes of comparison, take Euclid, a seminal figure in the history of geometry. He's doing some amazing stuff at about 300 BC. If you want to move closer to the origins of economics, consider Isaac Newton. He was coming up with the laws of gravitation and also the calculus in the 17th century at roughly the same time when economic reasoning, which makes sense, is just barely getting underway at all. Newton, as you may know, wrote a small amount on economic topics, on monetary economics, but he got a lot further when it came to physics. The ancient Greeks and some other older cultures made some very real progress on astronomy, which is quite difficult and, of course, very far away from everyday life. The ancient Greeks also were wonderful philosophers. Contemporary philosophers still read Plato as being brilliant and relevant and worth talking about. And of course, all this was done well before the birth of Christ, when economic reasoning isn't really there. I don't have a good answer for why economics is so slow to develop compared to some other fields, but here are a few hypotheses. One is simply that economics violates the views of established interests in society, so maybe it was in earlier times ruling classes had some incentive in stifling the development of economics. It's a little hard to test this hypothesis, but still it's not obvious to me why it should be true. Ask yourself a simple question. In the times of, say, the Roman Empire, wouldn't you have expected the Roman emperors or Senate to have wanted to have good economists to advise them, not necessarily to liberate the entire economy, but simply in order to be able to raise more revenue or have greater military strength? Yet it doesn't seem that this is what was going on. Another possible hypothesis is simply that maybe there were really very good writings on economics in antiquity, but perhaps the relevant texts were lost. After all, most of the books of antiquity have not come down to us, and maybe it was a kind of pure luck that we have the works of Plato, but not the works of an equivalently talented economist from, say, ancient Athens. There's no evidence for this, and I suspect it's not true. You do see various writings from antiquity which touch upon economic topics, and reading those writings, I don't get the sense that there were parallel but lost figures with great economic sophistication. The most likely answer I find difficult to believe, but I suppose it is my best guess, and that's the notion that simply economics is counterintuitive and also really hard. That maybe we as human beings, we are programmed to moralize first, or to think in terms of simple narratives rather than applying the more sophisticated constructs of economics. And if you think about it, well, some of the key ideas of economics, maybe they are pretty indirect or difficult to grasp. And that would include the idea of an invisible hand, the idea of spontaneous order, the idea of secondary consequences. All of those took a long time for human beings really to understand in economic terms. So can it be the case that, say, a simple graph of supply and demand is that much harder than Euclid, or for that matter, Isaac Newton? I'm not sure, but it sure is an interesting idea to think about.